in the Development Corporation report, we really tried to accentuate the need for stronger and clearer connections between the objectives of Development Cooperation and the range of policies and tools that DAC members have at their disposal, and that have a potential positive or negative effect on developing countries and on global public goods. So I think, on the contrary, we would say that we should be reinvigorating the policy coherence for a sustainable development agenda, and we should be deploying all resources available in order to strengthen the links between global, national and subnational policies and programming. Turning to the fit for purpose agenda, I think, again, the report is asking really very many pertinent questions in terms of retooling development cooperation. And I would say that many of the same questions we are also working together with the DAC as a secretariat on many of the issues raised, if not all of the issues raised in the action agenda. And that's why I think there is scope for more sort of discussion on each one. Let me just raise a few of them, a few of the issues that the sort of constituent parts of the Fit for Purpose agenda that are set out in the overview. So on poverty and inequality, I think, again, our own Development Cooperation report sets out and aligns with many of the trends that are identified in the Reality of Aid report in respect of where ODA is going. And I think it's fair to conclude that overall, ODA allocations are not yet meeting the needs of reaching the furthest behind. Aid to least developed countries is slightly ticking upwards, but that's following a number of years of steady decline. And certainly, again, the international commitment is not, we're not yet there in terms of the allocations to least developed countries. I think also the report, the Development Cooperation report, highlights that allocations to fragile and severely off-track countries are also particularly volatile from one year to the next, and that is really potentially hindering the ability of those countries to develop long-term development strategies and to plan and to budget, and that's clearly undermining effectiveness. I think the DCR actually goes a step further in terms of thinking about the operational implications of focusing on poverty and inequality and leaving no one behind and reaching the furthest behind first. So in the DCR, for example, we talk about a deliberate and systematic approach, portfolio-wide approach to leaving no one behind. And as part of that, we talk about equitable, inclusive and sustainable development forming the centrepiece of all of the theories of change that our DAC members are developing in order to design their development cooperation policies and programs. We talk about systematically identifying and tracking those that are furthest behind and those that are being left behind in the context of the countries in which they're working. We talk about adjusting the allocation models so that we're true to that pledge. And we talk about updating partnership strategies so that we are proactively identifying the agents of change and creating an enabling environment and support for those agents of change, including civil society and women's organisations and local businesses who can potentially give voice to and empower the poorest and most excluded. At the same time, I think the DCR, and it's a very big report, so there's lots in here, the DCR really does seek to showcase evidence of where development cooperation is and does add real value in from a rights-based perspective and in terms of targeting the poorest people. So I think it's important, again, glass half full, it's important to build on those experiences and to identify the pockets of good practice and to discuss what that means for us as a community. A few other very specific issues. So we are in the private sector week, so I think Paul would probably have more to say on that, but I mean, I think we should take comfort from this week. I think for too long the conversation has been around leveraging and shifting the billions to trillions, and not enough of the conversation has been around what is the evidence and where these resources best targeted, and how can we ensure that these resources are really adding value from a development perspective, and that we're focused on the ends and not the means. So the fact that we're talking about development impact this week, and the fact that we're talking about principled engagement with the private sector to make sure ownership is at the centre of these engagements, and that we continue to make sure that aid is untied, I think that's really important, and let's take comfort from this week in terms of that private sector agenda. I think shrinking civil society space is also, again, I see a lot of DAC members really acknowledging and seeking to identify ways of addressing the shrinking space for civil society and all that it does, and I think there's a positive agenda there. And again, under the leadership of Karen, there's a some normative work that we can continue to do around engagement with civil society and development cooperation. Same on humanitarian aid, and the experts are in the room here as well, but there's clearly, I think the report talks about the sort of opportunity cost of increasing humanitarian budgets in terms of investing in long-term development and root causes and prevention. And again, the discussion that's happening in the DAC around the humanitarian development peace nexus is pointing exactly in that direction and seeks to address exactly those types of issues. Also on multilateral aid, the report talks about the sort of behaviours of DAC members in terms of an effective multilateral system, and there's analysis and recommendations produced by the OECD that also speaks to those issues. So basically all that to say that there's promising conversations happening in this community around all of the action, around all the action points in the Reality of Aid report. 1 minute. So let me end with a slightly broader reflection. So in my personal view, development cooperation is such a heavily scrutinised sort of public policy space. I would go as far as saying that it's possibly the most scrutinised public policy space. And the OECD clearly is part of that machinery around checks and balances, and it's an important function that we play. Development cooperation is not perfect, nor is any other public policy. It's certainly subject to political vagaries. I think I will leave that. I will say only that. I think we see, again, on a daily basis, it's highly vulnerable. I mean, let's not forget, it's vulnerable, particularly in the context of some of the movements and political sort of discussions that are happening in several countries. It's vulnerable. And it's also quite deeply misunderstood amongst many of our public. And so I think, yet in all of that, it still remains remarkably resilient. And I think we should be taking solace in the fact that the scrutiny exists and that the resilience is there, and that we should really work with the opportunities that provides. I think we should continue with the checks and balances, and I think most importantly we should continue investing in the evidence about what is working and what is not, and showcasing that and debating that across constituencies as we seek to do today. But let's go beyond naming the shortcomings. Let's actually identify the bottlenecks, and let's get practical and let's get real about what we can do about it. So in conclusion, we welcome this report at the OECD. We identify with many of the trends that are set out. I think we benefit from the perspective that it gives us and the case studies that it provides. And in the words of the Development Cooperation report, let's now join forces to leave no one behind. Thank you.